Welcome to another episode of Keeping It Realty with Marc and Brian. So before we get started, a big shout out to East Brother Beer Company for being the show's sponsor. They're located in Point Richmond. Great location, a lot of fun. Beer, game, wine. Actually, they have wine sometimes with little local partnerships that they do. But definitely...
Beer and wine, it's like a great combination.
Right. And they do a lot of really good events there. So definitely go check them out in Point Richmond. So let's jump right into our very first topic, and that's AB 1482. So probably you've been hearing a lot happening in the last couple of weeks. AB 1482 was introduced by Assemblymember Chu, and this is rent control. It started off as rent control initially, and this would be statewide rent control. It would not affect cities that already have rent control, but then they modified this bill a bit differently once it went into the Senate, and they actually attached just cause eviction protections there. So now we have a rent control and just cause eviction bill. It's already passed the Assembly with the latest modifications, and it's passed the Senate, and it's now on Governor Newsom's desk for him to sign no later than October 13th. And then if he signs it, which we're pretty sure he's going to sign it. And one interesting thing to keep in mind is that he also has a veto factor. So he could actually take certain things out of the actual bill. So he doesn't have to actually sign the bill the way it was passed by the Senate and Assembly.
Actually, it's a little sneaky the way that they put this one together.
Yeah, they did. But it is what it is, and here we are looking at rent control and just cause statewide on January 1st. So what we wanted to do is kind of break down some of the key components of this law. Now, again, it could potentially change if he ends up pulling something out of that law, or I don't think he can add anything to it, but he can pull certain things out of it.
Well, just a quick recap of what in prior episodes we talked about the statewide rent control that was coming, and originally a lot of the components that it had was a 7% rental increase plus CPI, which when you add 7% plus CPI, which is anywhere from 2% to 2.5%, you're at an average annual rental increase of between 8, 9, maybe almost 10%, 9.5%. And that was totally acceptable. Now, the way that it's written, in my opinion, it's 5 plus CPI, so it could be as high as 7% to 7.5%, maybe 8% at the max. But very rarely will it ever get up to 10%, unless the cost, the CPI suddenly just shoots through the roof, at which point everything else is shooting through the roof, the consumer price index.
Yeah, so that's going to be the key component. It's the 5% plus CPI yearly rent increases that you can do. Now, they're going to allow you to do no more than 2 incremental increases per year. And if you've increased your rents after March 15th of 2019, then if you increase it more than the 5% plus CPI, you will be required to roll it back. So that's one thing that I really don't hear a lot of people talking about in the media, but it's big. I mean, it's going to require a lot of people to roll back rents. Otherwise, going forward, if you don't do it, in fact, you're automatically going to be out of compliance and potentially have to reimburse the tenants.
Right. In fact, let's look at the impact of that. For people who went through their normal rental increase of what they were allowed to do back in March of 2019, or maybe purchased a property based upon rental increases that had just been done, and then therefore the value of that property is based on its net operating income, based on those rents that you had. Well, by rolling it back or decreasing the rent, well, you're not decreasing your expenses. You don't get to roll back your expenses. Your property taxes, by which went up by how much you bought it for, don't get rolled back. And so that rollback affects the value of your property, and in many cases it could be significant. It could devalue the property by several $100,000. It could bring your debt service coverage below what was acceptable to the lender at the time of making the loan, and essentially just reduces your cash flow. So it unduly penalizes people who were probably already sensitive to the fact that there was a rent gouging law in place at the time, and were just going through no more than 10% rental increases. But if they increase the rent at 10%, then the chances are they're going to have to roll back that rent that was imposed back in 2019 or March of 2019, and then potentially devalue the property, reduce their cash flow, potentially put themselves into a minor bind.
So if you're looking to do a rent increase now before the new law goes into effect, my recommendation is do 5%. That's safe bet, 5%, because after the law passes, once they release what CPI metric they're going to use, I mean, they're claiming local CPI, but how hyper-local they'll get, they haven't made clear. But once they release those CPI figures, then at that point, do another incremental increase for the 2%, 3%, 3.5%, depending on your specific area. So that's going to be your main component of rent control. Rent control does not apply to single-family homes unless you own more than 10, and it exempts any properties that are 15 years or newer. And then just cause, one final thing before we go on to the next segment, but just cause applies to tenancies beyond 12 months. So one of the negative side effects that this bill is going to create is you will have a lot of landlords that will rent for only 12 months and literally give notices to tenants to leave prior to the end of the 12 months, depending on how the market is doing. Obviously, if the market's going up or if they don't want to risk a tenant potentially being an issue because of prior problems, you're going to see a lot of tenants getting close to that 12-month mark, and they're just going to get a notice to vacate, and there's nothing that can be done about that. So let's get to our next topic, and this is understanding real estate terms. So it's real estate's been around since the dawn of time. I mean, it's and
well, a lot of the laws that we use in real estate are from Old English law, with the exception of the fact that we own the land as opposed to lease the land from the king.
Yeah, exactly.
But we still pay property taxes.
And that's a very interesting little bit of history. A lot of the terms that we have today and how we do business really comes from like ages ago, England, UK. And so
anybody who watches Game of Thrones or those medieval stuff and they talk about lords, well, that's what those lords became landlords. You know, before it would be like you own and control everything from here to the eye can see. Now we have parcels. So things have evolved.
Yeah. So there's a few terms that some people have. They don't quite understand it, and we're coming from a public perspective. The public doesn't understand some of these terms, and so we just want to briefly cover them. Term number one is agency. It's amazing how many people don't understand agency. You want to break that down? Well,
essentially in layman terms, it's who works for who. Are you the buyer's agent, and are you working in behalf of the buyer versus you're working in behalf of the seller? Or a lot of times when you're thinking about legal matters, and one side, a plaintiff, will have a lawyer representing them, and a defendant will have a lawyer representing them. It really just delineates who's taking care of what and what each person's responsibility is to the client, which actually segues really nicely into the next word, fiduciary.
So a fiduciary is someone that has to act at any cost in your best interest. They cannot put their own self-interest I learned something the other day. There's another term and I'm blanking on it, but it's not their self-interest, but putting aside your own interest.
Yes.
Yeah. But anyway, they can't do that. A fiduciary has to act in your best interest at any given time, which makes California real estate very unique with brokers and real estate agents that you don't find in some other states.
Right. Now, when you think of the word fiduciary, too, and acting on behalf of somebody else, that word usually applies to attorneys and doctors, right? So attorneys, you'll always hear this all the time, attorney-client privilege. So you're only going to disclose what you're allowed to disclose, and certain things are completely confidential when you're an attorney. Well, those same types of legalities or responsibilities to a party, to another party, apply to realtors in California. But as Marc said, in other states where real estate agents don't act as attorneys, whereby they write contracts or give advice, they simply are professional space showers. And
now, one thing to point out is that in California, licensed real estate agents and brokers are not allowed to actually write contracts. They're only allowed to fill in spots on a pre-created contract. Very interesting fact there, isn't it?
Yeah, that's supposed to be true, but then you get into other aspects of real estate where we don't even use the pre-filled contracts that everybody's accustomed to, like either AIR or California Association of Realtors. But there's a method by which attorneys use where they use editable Word documents, and then they will definitely, instead of just giving a counter proposal or an addendum, they will redline specific areas so they can show the changes and then date stamps by which certain terms that were set forth in writing were now stricken out. And so in that essence, you actually are not just filling in blanks, you are actually filling in aspects of the contract. But yes, so it's one of those really weird things where a lot of times attorneys will typically accuse California real estate agents of illegally practicing law without a law license.
Now, the next term is dual representation, which a lot of people get confused with this, including brokers themselves and real estate agents. So dual representation, the way it's defined here in California, is any broker representing multiple clients on a transaction. So they could be representing the buyer and they could be representing the seller. Now, if it's two different agents, but under the same broker, it's still considered dual representation. That's where a lot of the confusion comes into play, because you will have people or one agent say, well, I'm representing the buyer, and you have another agent from the same company saying, well, I'm representing the seller. But legally, that broker who oversees both of those agents has a dual representation to both of the clients.
Yeah, little fun fact, in Florida, dual representation is actually illegal. You're not allowed to do that. And Florida is probably more litigious than California is. So the amount, I used to have a broker's license in Florida. I let it expire 10 years ago because I wasn't using it anymore. But it's illegal to have dual representation in Florida, whereas in California it's perfectly legal, provided that you have certain disclosures and you have a lot more, you have a greater fiduciary responsibility to both parties in that instance.
So our next topic is how to increase value and your rent prices at an apartment complex. Now, in a prior Keeping It Realty episode, we did talk about some improvements and upgrades you can make to your actual apartment unit that could get you some more rent. But there's another factor to increase in rent is the actual complex itself. You could do everything you want to the actual interior of a unit, but if your complex is crappy, well, you're still not going to get those top market rents. So what are some very cheap ways in order to upgrade your complex? Number one, right off the bat, is landscaping. It's amazing what you can do with some simple, low maintenance trees, bushes, and really just dressing up the landscape. Or if you have a lot of dead grass areas or areas that have really nothing going on, put in some artificial turf, put in some picnic benches, very simple stuff that wouldn't increase any liability risk to you, but at the same time improve the overall feel of the building. Typically, new paint jobs are a good way of sprucing up the building, along with giving the building a specific name. Especially if you have a building that was built in the 50s or 60s, one of the things you'll notice is that a lot of the signage, the original signage, is still there, and it just looks horrible and outdated. So simply getting a new sign up on the property gives pride of ownership. And when tenants see that the landlord has a pride of ownership in the building, they're happy and want to live in that building. Brian, do you have any suggestions?
Well, a lot of the different things that Marc is talking about, essentially what they do is they create demand. People want to live there because it's nice for all these various reasons, whether the weather's good, it's very walkable to different places, the outside is pretty, it's got a cool name. And as you increase demand for this property, people are willing to pay more. So that is actually the way the value is going up, by simply making it more appealing. Some places are a dump, like in San Francisco, you'll find places that have not been taken care of, but by simple supply and demand, the rents are high. Now, like as Marc is bringing out, as you're making it more appealing for a tenant to live there, you create the better tendency for tenants to compete for that unit, and therefore be willing to pay for a little bit more.
Plus, it also helps decrease the amount of vacancies you have, because people then want to stay living at the property, and they're more willing to accept rent increases and more willing to sign long-term lease renewals because of that. We have one building right now that we're working on that is a very old 1930s style duplex style complex. So there's like 10 duplexes, and it's all part of one complex. Now the windows have no framing around them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's stucco siding. So one of the very simple things we're going to do is basically...
Which one is that one?
It's over in Hayward. One of the very simple things we're going to do is put some simple wood trimming around the window and create windowsills on all the windows.
So it's just a facade.
Exactly.
It's not a real trim.
Correct.
You're just dressing it up.
Correct. So we're doing that. We're going to give the entire complex a new paint job. There's some old square wooden posts that what we're going to do is... put kind of like some crown molding around it to make it look like they're thicker columns, and it really add a lot of different feel to it. We're putting in 3D numbers that you can buy at Home Depot for very cheap. They sit like maybe half an inch off the wall, but it gives a 3D feel to it. And in an empty space we have at the complex, we're going to put a few trees to give some shade, put in a new picnic area, and some simple stuff like that. You'll be surprised. It makes a big difference. Pride of ownership, again.
In fact, one of the things you just touched on, creating a common area for the tenants to gather around. Like in some of the larger complexes, it's possible to do this where you have little picnic areas by the pool or have community barbecues to kind of give that feel-good atmosphere to the tenants, that they're appreciated for being there. That also increases value. It's harder to do that on smaller units like 4-plexes or 6-plexes, where you're not going to have a lot of open space. But in larger complexes that we manage, like the 85-unit buildings or 90-unit buildings, where there's pools and walkways, those little things that we do for the tenants also make it a nicer place to live, and makes the landlord happier because you have better retention and people willing to pay more to live there.
Yeah, and if you have a driveway or parking lot that needs to be repaired or needs to be redone, get someone to come in and redo it. Now, those can be very expensive and pricey, so that's something that you have to consider when you're calculating your numbers and your figures. So there's a lot that can be done, very simple stuff that doesn't cost a lot of money. Sometimes with larger complexes, it may come down to, if you have a parking issue that makes the building look really bad, is simply going through, repainting parking spots, getting them assigned to tenants, making sure you have the proper fire lanes marked in, and just giving it a nice clean look. It goes a long way. So our next topic is how to prepare for a security deposit small claims court. So we've actually, I've gone through this, I'm sure you have too, gone through this a few times in our career, and when a tenant moves, we return the security deposit minus any deductions for damages or unpaid rent. Now, in some cases, you have tenants that will want to dispute it for one reason or another, and depending on if an agreement cannot be made on that dispute, the tenant does have the right to take the landlord to a small claims court and argue why they want the full deposit or a portion of that deposit back. And so one thing we wanted to do here is kind of break down, well, how do you prepare for this from a landlord perspective? And so the number one thing I think you need to have is documentation on the entire move out. So you need to have your photos from when the tenant moved in. You need to have photos of when the tenant moved out. You need to have your move-in inspection from when the tenant moved in, and the move-in or move-out inspection done when the tenant moved out. Now, one of the things you also want to do is send out, and this is one thing that's commonly missed by so many people. When a tenant gives you notice to vacate, you are required by state law to provide notice to the tenant that they have a right to a pre-move-out inspection. And the pre-move-out inspection would give the tenant up to 2 weeks to for you to come through, inspect their unit, and anything that you would deduct off of the deposit, they then have 2 weeks to make those repairs and get it corrected prior to moving out. Now, it's still not a guarantee that they'll get the entire deposit back when they move out, because then there's the final inspection done afterwards. But it gives a tenant notice that they have a right to pre-move out inspection. Failure to give a copy of that notice, the tenant can argue to have the entire deposit returned back to them, and they'll win.
These little things that we're talking about are loopholes that tenants' rights or attorney tenants' rights activists will use to exploit whenever the tenant does decide to take you to small claims court because they're disputing the charges you placed or deductions on their security deposit. And depending upon the city you're in, it's going to be very important because sometimes when you're up against a tenant who's got free representation in areas where they have very heavy rent control, then it might almost be worth it a lot of times to simply settle. In fact, a lot of times that's what you have to go through, right, Mark? They make you go to the mediation room,
correct,
especially if the tenant is threatening to go to a jury trial. So I'm not sure if they're still letting you go to jury trial and the landlord has to pay it, or
yeah, I mean, in small claims court, it's up to $10,000, and typically a judge is going to review the case and make a decision. However, one thing that you also have to weigh into the whole situation is, well, how friendly are the judges going to be to the tenants, and then how much are they going to scrutinize your documents? So if your documents are not properly in order, then the judge or even the mediator could scrutinize your documents, and that's where you may want to consider a settlement.
Right.
Try to meet halfway or something.
In fact, it's getting so technical now to the point where you want to know which judge you're up against, because you got to remember these judges all have different personalities. So some of them are going to be very pro-tenant. Some of them will be more moderate and actually apply the law. But I mean, we even had a case where we saw very easily the judge broke the law, forgave the tenant multiple times, even though just cause was in place, caught their attorney lying, said out loud to their attorney that you don't have to lie to me, and then proceeds to rule in favor of the tenant. So,
Yeah, so you just never know how the actual trial will go. So you typically, as much as possible, want to get it settled beforehand. So unless you have an ironclad case where you've got everything documented, everything was done properly, then you really want to consider some kind of settlement. Try to come to an agreement with the tenant prior to going to court. Now, one thing to also keep in mind is going back to actual documentation. So you want to make sure you have photos. You want to make sure you had the proper notices sent out. But what if the tenant argues they never got that notice? That happens a lot. So in order to protect yourself, you want to make sure you have documentation that the proper deposit return and even the check that was sent to him was put in the mail and sent out. Now, how do you provide proof on that? Well, I always recommend people to get a certificate of mailing when they go to the post office. Some people like to do certified mailing, but the problem with certified mailing is that if the tenant refuses it, it will get returned back to you, and technically it was never received by the person. So always do a certificate of mailing, because there's no requirement for the person to accept it or no signature. The post office, however, guarantees it gets to an address provided on that notice of the certificate of mailing, and that holds up in court, and that is another very valuable tip for everyone. So let's get into our property analysis here. Brian, what do you have for us?
Okay, so today I'm going to analyze a property. It's a 6-unit building in the city of Richmond, again, where there's rent control. And this is going to be a little bit different analysis. And we're going to talk about, actually incorporate some of the definitions we talked about in the prior clips. One specifically, fiduciary. Making sure that you give your buyer the proper advice whether to go forward or to kill the deal. And more importantly, caveat emptor, buyer beware. Now why I'm going to throw a lot of those definitions in the mix of this specific analysis is, one, I found this amazing 6-unit building in the city of Richmond where there's rent control. And going off of the offering memorandum of the property, we saw, and we're looking at the rent roll of the property, which shows the current rents, right? But in the fine print, it says assumes Section 8 market rent, right? Now, right next to the pro forma market rent. Now, those are some significant points here. So we look at the rent roll of the offering memorandum, we add up the rents, and we get a grand total of current actual $10,285 a month, $123,420 a year. So that's actually a pretty good income. Now, the market rents for these units are $2,195. These are a 2-bedroom, 1-bath in the city of Richmond. So there is rent control in Richmond again, and if you just took the actual market rents and you applied them to all 6 units, then instead of $10,285 a month, you really have $13,170 a month, or $158,000 a year. So there's a 20% loss to lease there. However, at the asking price for the property, which was $1,325,000, this wasn't such a bad property. In fact, it was a pretty good property. The property was advertised at a 6% cap, whereas when I applied my own metrics or to underwriting using a 5% vacancy factor and a full 6% management fee, the cap rate was a little lower, 5.63, but nonetheless still a very good cap rate. So this property that was asking $1,325,000, we actually got it into contract for $1,315,000. So again, a big plus for my buyer going in, because by simply reducing that price from $1,325,000, not only did they have to come in with a little bit lower down payment, but when you apply a typical 30% down payment to a $10,000 less than the asking, or a $1,315,000 asking price, well, you get a very good debt service coverage, right? So that means that because of that little differential in price, the property taxes are a little bit lower. And so in prior episodes, you've heard me say that you want to look at and underwrite this from a bank standpoint, meaning what criteria is a bank looking for to determine how much of a loan they're going to give you? Well, if we just use the standard 30% down and the requirement of a 1.2% debt service coverage ratio, meaning that the net operating income, which is the current rents minus the expenses, but before making a mortgage payment, that net operating income as compared to the principal and interest payment monthly, in this case on a 70% loan to value, that net operating income is at least 120% or 20% greater than the proposed mortgage. So again, if you have a mortgage that's $10,000, you have to have at least a net operating income, or before you make a mortgage payment, of $12,000. Now, with the actuals that we got into place of being in contract for $1,315,000, and then looking at the current rents that were advertised in the offering memorandum of $123,000 a year, and then taking the actual expenses, but maybe increasing the vacancy that was used from 2% to 5%, because that's what a bank is going to use, and then increase the property management to a full 6%. Running the property at about a 37.76, call it a 38% expense ratio, we still have a very acceptable net operating income of $74,000. So when you compare that against the contract price of $1,315,000, you get a 5.63 cap. Again, not bad, not quite the 6 you're looking for. However, with that 30% down, instead of getting the typical 1.2% debt service coverage that a bank wants, we were really at 1.32, and this was based on current actuals, right? So one, that would be a great thing for a buyer to get into. The cash flow on that after making the mortgage payment is about $18,000 a year. You'd only need about $426,000 to acquire this property. And then when you apply the principal reduction, you really have an actual taxable event or income on the property of $32,000 a year. So when you compare the $32,000 a year to the $426,000 acquisition price, the down and closing, right? Now no longer using the cap rate, which assumes you bought the property cash, then you have a 7.66% return on your money. So again, all very good things to look for when you're looking at an apartment building. And then when you compare that against the market rent, again, if you have rent control in Richmond, so what is it, like 3.6 a year?
3.5%.
3.5? Okay, so I use 3.6 in my rental increases. So there's about a 20% difference between what you're currently getting and what the market will bear. Excuse me, hold on, phone's going off. But if you were to get it up to market, then this property using the same, just a slight increase in the expenses from $44,000 a year to $47,000 a year, now increases the value of the property to about $1,907,000. That's what it would be if it was at market rent. However, and this is where I talked about earlier about the caveat emptor, buyer beware, the current advertised income on the property, but as compared to the estoppel certificates, which is, for those of you who don't know, again, today seems to be the day for definitions. Estoppels are a up-to-the-minute, not a rental agreement, but an up-to-date document that confirms with a current signature from the tenant and a current signature from the owner what the actual security deposits are that are being held, and more importantly, the actual rents that the landlord is charging the tenants. So when we compared the estoppels to what was advertised as the current rent, we saw a pretty distinct difference. So instead of $10,287 a month, it was only $7,440 a month. And I mean, this was very disappointing because it drops that 1.32 debt service coverage ratio down to like a negative number where you're actually losing money. And that's even after putting 45% down. So instead of putting 30% down, now when you look at what the actual rents are as per the estoppels, then you have to put 45% down just to be at a break even, or a 0.9 or a 1.0 debt service coverage ratio. So there's a couple of ways to look at that. One, if you are using the actual rents, which are $7,440 or $89,000 a year, as opposed to what it was advertised at $123,000 a year, and you try to apply at least a 5 cap to your money, to the new operating income, meaning that instead of making $74,000 a year as advertised before you make a mortgage payment, you're really only making $43,000 a year. Well, then this property is only worth about $794,000. So you're overpaying for it by $520,000. You see this a lot in places like San Francisco, where people are willing to buy at a lower cap rate. In fact, the cap rate, if you bought it at $1,315,000, what we had it in contract for, then you're really coming down to as low as a 3.32% cap rate. So again, cap rates vary from area to area, because in areas like San Francisco or El Cerrito, people are willing to purchase at a lower return or a lower cap rate because they perceive a lower risk, right? In this case, we're actually going in and buying it at a lower cap rate than you would in a place that's compared to El Cerrito or San Francisco or Walnut Creek. And so, again, going back to that definition of fiduciary, as having a fiduciary to my client, I had to advise that this is a deal that we shouldn't go forward on. I mean, we looked at it a couple of different ways, like could we increase the rents, and we applied, what if we apply the current rental increases that could take place, that could actually be applied to this property of 3.6. And again, when we did that, even if 3 years down the line, we're still only hitting a value of $895,000, and that's if the existing tenant stayed there. One of the things that was proposed by the agent is that, well, we can buy the tenants out or evict them. But again, as we know, and what we've heard about in prior topics, not only is there rent control in Richmond, but there's statewide rent control that's imminent. And again, it has just cause in place and things of this nature.
Well, the interesting thing is that statewide prevents any city prevents any city from imposing stricter rent controls. Now, the cities with already stricter rent controls are exempt, and they don't have to comply with, for example, Richmond at 3.5% increase does not have to allow a 5% plus CPI increase. However, the one thing in that new bill for statewide rent control is that there is a small little section there that would apply 5% plus CPI increases to government housing.
Oh yeah, that was the other aspect of this.
And that could be something that City of Richmond just simply modifies their addendum or their ordinance to adopt that and all of a sudden it's in effect, and they could do that.
Well, a couple of the things here, when we were looking at different ways as to possibly to stay into the deal, right? We were looking at, one, banked rents, and we were looking at the fact that 3 of the tenants in this property are Section 8. Now, why that's significant is because they're government subsidized tenants where these normal rent control laws normally do not apply. However, now, with the statewide rent control that's coming into place, government agencies like Section 8 will now also be applicable. So you can't go right to market like you would normally would on tenants that are currently Section 8, which was one of the value add plays or one of the techniques that we might be able to justify buying the property and not completely losing our shirts. And in this particular case, that was no longer going to be applicable. So when you're buying property, you always got to be very technical. You always got to be look at 5 years down, 6 years down, 10 years down. And you also got to look at the fact that if some of these rental increases that were just recently put into effect that actually got it to the current rent that shows on those estoppels, which is a little higher than it was before, but isn't what was actually shown as to be current rent, then those rents might get rolled back too, and they're already low.
Yeah, so it comes down to, if you're going to buy property, you need to be working with the right professionals to be looking at every aspect and looking at the property and the documentation, rent increases, leases from every possible angle, because that goes back to the word fiduciary.
Yeah, work with an agent who's willing to say, my commission is going to be lost in this, but I should kill the deal because you're going to lose your shirt if you buy this property. Yeah. Or at least you're not going to be very happy, right? True. It's not in your best interest. And that's really what it comes down to. So happy hunting out there for you good investors.
Thank you to East Brother Beer for being the show's sponsor, and hopefully you catch us on the next episode. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or watch us on Facebook and YouTube.
And by the way, thank you all for you out there who do interact with us via email or LinkedIn or text. Just yesterday night, I was on a business call about 10 p.m. and I get this text from an anonymous text, because this shows up on my phone as an unknown number. I just see the digits, and the gentleman identifies himself as somebody who's watching the show and wanted to know what the name of the show was because he was watching it, was very interested, and then discovered, or his connection dropped. So he's trying to get back to watching the show, and he wanted the information.
So as far as the name of the show, why don't you just lean that way? I'll lean this way, and we can kind of show the background. Keeping it realty.
Keeping it realty.
I probably should get out of the way.
Yeah, you should get out of the way.
There we go.
There you go. So, we like the interaction, and we appreciate you guys who are watching us and following us. And so we were having this little text conversation as to background and things of this nature, and so it was quite interesting. So I won't give the full name of the individual, but if you're watching, Roy, hey, thanks for reaching out to me yesterday, and maybe one day we'll meet and talk about some actual deals.
Yeah, thank you for watching.
See you next time.